welcome back. So, with the new summer banner coming around, we now have 2 new inheritable weapons for swords and axes, and they're really, really good. It's essentially the latter half of the Divine Tearfang Refine, which is arguably the stronger effect of the 2 effects that you get from the weapon. But that's a side point. Basically, it's now inheritable to every sword and axe unit in the game, which means that both slow and fast units can actually perform quite well now, especially the infantry ones. So I wanted to go over my thoughts overall on the weapons and the types of builds you could do on any sort of unit you really want to slap it on. So with that out of the way, we may as well just go right into it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is basically just the latter half of the Divine Tearfang Refine. Divine Tearfang grants 10 attack and 10 defense, provided that both conditions are met, and it grants 50% damage reduction against any magical hit on the first hit. Any more than that, you'll have to go with Deflect Magic or anything of the sort. So if you want to get that magic damage reduced, then there you go. However, the guaranteed follow-up in Divine Tearfang is based on the foe's HP stat rather than any sort of proximity effect, as opposed to Coral Saber that grants plus 5 attack and defense and a guaranteed follow-up if either the unit is within 2 spaces of an ally or if they initiate combat, meaning that there is quite a bit of flexibility in using this weapon overall, whether you want to use it in the player phase or in the enemy phase. The condition is definitely better for sure, but I wouldn't really write out Divine Tearfangs because 50% is really, really lenient. But even then, I'm kind of surprised they made this an inheritable, because even without the damage reduction, it's really similar to the PRF. The only thing you're really missing out on is an additional amount of attack and defense. And the damage reduction is only really going to be prevalent on Omni-Tanking, but Omni-Tanking right now is not really in a good spot, especially since it's kind of superseded by saves anyway. So, in my opinion, this is really close to just being an inheritable Divine Tearfang. And because it's very close to Divine Tearfang as a weapon, you could basically run a similar amount of skills and sets that you could run on Seth and Sigurd. So, let's go talk about those real quick. One of the more prevalent sets that you can run is a Gale Force set with Times Pulse, Heavy Blade, and Attack Defense Bond 4 on a Wings of Mercy composition with Gale Force units. So because Coral Saber allows you to get a guaranteed follow-up attack if the unit in question initiates combat, they don't have to really worry about their speed all too much. They can stack it if you want, so you can bypass impact effects, and I'll go over that in a second. But basically the idea here is that you go in with Wings of Mercy, and then with Heavy Blade, you're able to charge up Gale Force from 4 cooldown to 0 cooldown and then go again in another combat, which is really, really good. There is merit to speed stacking here too if you want to bypass an impact effect, but at that point you may as well just run no follow-up, but I'll cover that in a second. If you want to go into the Omni-Tanking role with it, which I don't really recommend doing, you could also run Distance Stance with no counter disrupt. You get a guaranteed follow-up no matter what, so you don't have to sacrifice any slot for quick riposte, which is really, really good. You could run other sort of competitive B slots such as no C disrupt, no follow-up, lulls, spiral, anything of the sort, and then with breath and joint drive attack you should be able to sustain quite well and tank quite a bit. But then you could also make them into a melee specialist with attack defense unity, no follow-up, and joint drive attack with steady breath, so they can sustain and output a significant amount of damage. The idea here is that you're basically going to stack up 2 of your most important stats while simultaneously putting out a significant amount of damage. No follow-up, despite being present on this slow unit build, can work just for securing the guaranteed follow-up, which is really, really good. Seliph is actually a really good user of no follow-up because you can secure your own guaranteed follow-up, which is really, really good. You don't have to worry about any sort of impact effects. The only thing you will have to worry about after that is no follow-up, but it's not really too common on defense. So you can actually take advantage of it quite well on any sort of infantry unit, regardless of their speed. But then outside of the infantry ones, you also have the cav ones who can run trace or flows or whatever the case may be. So if you have like a Kent, for example, you can run Heavy Blade with Gale Force and trace, so you can actually act as a hit and run unit, which is really, really good. Coral Saber granting a guaranteed follow-up with that speed stat means that if there are impact effects, then he can actually just make a speed check, at which point he should win because the speed stat is pretty high. Especially when paired with Menace, it actually shouldn't be too bad, assuming you can get Menace off. Otherwise, you could just run a Rouse or some sort of support or whatever the case may be. As long as you can get visible buffs or debuff the foe, then it should make the check really, really easy, especially since Coral Saber also provides additional attack, at which point you should be good to go. But even the slower ones, such as Bertram, can actually work really well with a Sturdy Surge bonfire set. With Flow Guard, it should secure his own guaranteed follow-up. As long as there aren't any no follow-up effects present, he should be able to guarantee his own follow-up regardless of the foe's skills, which is really, really good. This essentially makes him a more quote-unquote accessible Sigurd, but that's also for debate because Sigurd is also on a 4% banner generally, and he's and you can get them randomly out of nowhere on those like 4-star specials. But the fact that it's so close to replicating Divine Tearfang and Sigurd is really telling of how good this weapon is, in my opinion. You're not really going to be using Sigurd as an enemy phase cav anyway, because those don't really do well. Even with Divine Tearfang providing a guaranteed follow-up, it's not really a good idea. So the damage reduction properties aren't really going to come into play regardless. But even then, outside of the additional attack and maybe additional defense, they're quite similar now, which is kind of weird to say, but that's what Intelligent System decided to do, so now I can use Bertram without him feeling like dead weight, which is really nice. Of course, you also have the Flyers and the Armors. The Flyers can pretty much do the same thing. If you want to give them a flow skill with a rain and then a catch skill, they can actually function similarly. They don't have the same amount of movement, which makes their threat range a bit worse. But because they can access rain skills, they can make heavy blade checks a lot easier, which is really nice. But then you also have the Armors, which may sound weird to do, but with Coral Saber and a fighter skill, they can essentially bypass impact skills. It's essentially the same thing as like the double quick riposte that you may have seen back in the day with Hector, and it's the same thing here. Basically, you're stacking guaranteed follow-up attacks, so if there is an effect that shuts down a follow-up attack, this will make it so you can double no matter what. But again, it does get shut down by no follow-up, so you have to be wary of that. And that's pretty much it for the swords. You do also have the axes because Seth does provide the same weapon, so all the axes can do the same thing as well. So if you want to run something in Arena, for example, with maybe a Balthus, now he's a lot more usable because he has the guaranteed follow-up. So even with this set having quick riposte built into it, the idea here is that you can basically have a guaranteed follow-up both in your weapon and your B slot, as mentioned earlier. So if there is an impact skill, then you could still double through it. Granted, you can still run no follow-up, which is definitely going to be a lot better, but if you don't have that, then you can still run quick riposte, and that works almost as well, but it still does the job, basically. And it scores 240 SP, so if you're looking for something budget enough, which may be weird to say because the rest of the kit isn't budget, you have something to work with. But then you also have the same thing with Flyers. They have Dive Bomb if you really want to use that. So with the guaranteed follow-up attack, they can cancel out any sort of impact effect, maybe from something like a Crom or a Lucina or whatever the case may be. Although the color matchup's not really good regardless, you can still cancel it out, and if you have the speed for it, then you can double through it without the need for any sort of no follow-up effect or flow, which is really, really good. So with Dive Bomb in mind, you can actually stack up your attack and speed and attack twice before the foe can counterattack, which is really, really good. And then there's one more thing you can do, which is pretty cool, all things considered. Because these weapons provide a guaranteed follow-up attack, you can actually run a sweep skill and cancel it out and then make it a speed check, essentially making it into a fire sweep weapon, which is really, really cool. Granted, you will have to make the speed check, but if you put it on a fast, speedy unit, then you really won't have to worry about it all too much. It's also worth keeping in mind that Fire Sweep Axe is still 5-star locked, so this is one of the more approachable options if you want some sort of Fire Sweep effect, quote unquote. Swords still have Fire Sweep Sword from Soleil, so that's not really an issue. I'm not sure why Fire Sweep Axe is still locked to the 5-star pool, but even with that being the case, with Seahorse Axe and the sweep skill, you're essentially getting a Fire Sweep effect, and if you can make the speed check, then you're going to double anyway, so it's really, really good. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the new weapons. Honestly, I'm really happy that these weapons exist, mainly because it's helping raise the floor for older units, or units that really couldn't do much prior, so like the slow units, for example, without a PRF. Now they can actually do something, which is really, really nice. It may kind of suck for the Sela fans and the Sigurd fans a bit, because now their Divine Tearfang is pretty much an inheritable, but that isn't to say you still shouldn't use them, because you still get 5 more attack and defense, and you have the damage reduction properties if you were to use them as an Omni Tank, but again, Omni Tanking is kind of falling off. But even with that being the case, it's still nice to see that these units have more options to work with. So, let me know what you think down below, and until next time, I'll see you later.